Chapter 24. A year passed. As years go, I'd known better. But I survived. I suppose you always do. There was my work, the blessed necessity of earning a living, even a lady. Life went on, and despite what I felt, refused to leave me behind. It's even possible that Brightman's little speech played its part, but what I'd learned about my parents, the tale my father's headstone had finally told, changed a great deal. But not everything, and perhaps the most important things stayed just the same. In any event, by the spring I was halfway back to myself, and with the mystery of my father's death finally resolved and accepted, all those other mysteries began to come back into my mind. There were enough of them. Would Subotin's body ever be found? Did Loganov know he was dead? Who was Traven? What role had he played? And what had happened to Granger? Though, in fact, a couple of discreet phone calls to Halifax answered that one. It seemed that the old man had survived, and was soldiering on at his clinic. Indeed, as I worried away at these questions, I was able to come up with quite a few answers, for in a general way I was now reasonably certain about what had happened. Subotin, it seemed obvious, had wanted money to finance the activities of his group, and through his contacts in Soviet intelligence had learned about Brightman, a unique find to say the least. Immensely wealthy and immensely vulnerable, he would have been well worth pursuing, even without the remains of his gold for furs fortune. And Subotin had pursued him, but then, I speculated, had pushed too hard. I was thinking of May. So far as I knew, Subotin had left her alone, and indeed she would have been too obvious a person for Brightman to pass the gold to. But this wouldn't have precluded Subotin from threatening her in order to put pressure on Brightman. In fact, it was the most powerful threat he could have possibly used. Too powerful. However, as soon as he made it, Brightman had bolted. For Brightman, May's safety had been everything, and the only time he'd exposed her to danger, in France, when she'd gone alone to the barge, had been unavoidable, for he had to make sure that Hamilton did as he'd promised, while at the same time not revealing that he was still alive. Yes, Brightman, quite literally, had been prepared to die for his daughter, and as far as Subotin was concerned, that's just what he'd done. But this hadn't stopped Subotin at all, for, with Brightman's KGB file in his hand, he'd simply gone from one member of Brightman's old group to another. Granger, Barry, Hamilton. Brightman would have to leave the gold somewhere, and these were the best candidates. Once you understood this, it even suggested another explanation to the hoary old riddle of why Subotin had broken into my house. Most likely, as I'd originally guessed, he'd been trying to keep me away from May by taking the telegram. But since he knew about Brightman's group, he must also have known about my parents, and so I might have been one of the names on his list. Even if this was true, however, I wouldn't have had much importance, not at that stage. Only later, after my abortive contact with Traven, had my role become potentially dangerous, hence their surveillance of my mother's old place in Georgetown. But that brought back another question. Who was Traven? There was no way to be sure. It was always possible, of course, that he was KGB, but the more I thought about him, the more he seemed to be a man with his own independent agenda. He'd had the photograph of Dimitrov, all those shots of May, and he'd attempted to set up a contact with me all on his own. Had he wanted the money for himself? Did he have other political goals to rival Subotin's? Even if I couldn't answer these questions with certainty, I began to put together a theory based on what he'd said on the phone and on that paper I'd discovered in the Berlin dump. Traven was an émigré, part of that wave of Russian immigration that has swept into the United States since the early 1970s. Since that time, tens of thousands of former Soviet citizens have settled in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and other large cities, 30,000 in the Brighton Beach section of Brooklyn alone. Most of these people are Jews. Few have any sympathy with the political goals Subotin was working for. But the extreme Russian nationalism that Loganov had talked about also has its adherents within this community, and Subotin and his group might have used such people for assistance and cover. Traven, if my theory was right, might have been someone like this, someone who'd been used by Subotin but then had broken away. His attempt to contact me would have doomed him, though he knew far too much in any event. He'd known about Dimitrov. Somehow he'd known about my father, something personal you wouldn't want a policeman to hear, and he'd suspected something of the truth about May. Why else had he taken all those photographs of her? But again, there it was, the real mystery, May herself. Who was she? Why, indeed, had Traven taken those photographs? And why, if he so wished to protect her, hadn't Brightman just given Subotin the gold right away? I knew the answer, or thought I did. In the end, the gold had counted for nothing, and Brightman had protected it only to prevent a far deeper secret from being revealed. But what was that secret? After all I'd found out, and all of my theories, I was back where I started, faced with the very first question of all. Who was May Brightman, and why had she been so important? It was a question I never expected to answer. In fact, I never expected to hear from her again. Through mutual friends, I tried to find out where she'd gone, but no one knew, and a letter to Cadogan, the lawyer in Toronto, only revealed that he didn't know either. Yet I couldn't let it alone. At a certain point, I remembered I'd felt that her secret was becoming my secret, and mine was merging with hers, and I still felt that way. What I'd learned about my father was half the truth, but I wanted it all. So as the summer went on, I kept worrying on. And now at least I knew one or two things. Shastov, not Brightman, not Georgy Dimitrov, was her natural father. I was certain of that. And the mother, of course, was not Florence Raines. She was a Russian woman who, in 1940, had tried to save her child from the desolation around her and the carnage she could see ahead. That was something to think about. Indeed, she must have been a remarkable woman. Would Yuri Shastov have married anything less? For even if many women had wished to do what she had done, few would have been able to. She possessed some sort of influence, some power which ultimately had enabled her to summon Harry Brightman all the way from Canada to the Soviet Union. What was that power? Why had he responded? In frustration, I remember I got out Traven's photographs, the ones I'd found in New Hampshire, and stared at them for hours, hoping to discover the answer. "Who are you?" I asked, "and who was your mother, and why did they all care so desperately?" But I got nowhere. Indeed, for a time I resolved to drop the whole subject, but I couldn't. I kept coming back to it, or it came back to me. In September, a magazine sent me a book to review, a history of the Stalinist Comintern, and it was full of stuff on Dimitrov. So I went over that angle again and kept coming up against the same old blank wall. The child wasn't Dimitrov's, and why should he have cared about Yuri Shastov's daughter? In 1940, especially, he'd had other things on his mind. Barry must have been right. If he'd saved that baby, it was only because it might have saved him, which meant that May must have been a truly miraculous child. Still, I didn't give up, and in the end I decided that Dimitrov must be involved in some way. In 1940, Harry Brightman had been in Pavonets. In 1940, both men and the child had turned up in Halifax. The coincidence was too great to be without meaning. Night after night, I thought about what Leonard Forbes had told me and read over the letter Dr. Charlie had written, the one Subotin had been trying to steal. Was it true, any of it? Some of it had to be. Traven's photograph confirmed that Dimitrov was there, and Brightman would hardly have gone through Florence Raines' business without having a reason. But what was that reason, and why had he gone to Russia in the first place? Granger, of course, claimed that he didn't know, and I believed him. That whole story about Brightman and the woman on Zinovьev's staff, Anna Kostina, that all rang true, that is, as the sort of lie Brightman would have told him. But perhaps, I considered, it might even be more substantial than that. Hadn't Cadogan mentioned right at the very beginning that Brightman had worried aloud about someone named Anna? And as Granger himself had pointed out, the best lies contain a germ of the truth. So one might reasonably ask, did Anna Kostina truly exist? Leonard Forbes hadn't heard of her, but then he doesn't know everything, quite. So I spent a day trying to find her, and to my surprise came across her name almost at once, Kostina A.P. It was right there in the index of one of the standard histories, and then, having found her the first time, I began seeing her everywhere. Just as Granger's had said, she'd been part of Zinnovieve's entourage and had been sentenced to a term in the Gulag during the first wave of the purges. I could find nothing about her after 1935. Earlier, however, she'd been a genuine political actor, albeit with a small part, close enough to Zinoviev to be considered a confidant, though probably not his mistress. She carried out several sensitive missions on his behalf. Of these, the most interesting had been in 1917, for it was she who'd actually received and transmitted the order to murder the Tsar. Fearful that the local Soviet might take matters into its own hands, Lenin and Zinoviev had dispatched her to Yekaterinburg, where the Tsar and his family were being held prisoners, with strict orders on their treatment and a new set of telegraph codes. Everything that had happened afterward had passed through her hands. What could I think when I made this connection? The possibility which it raised was so improbable, so unrespectable, if you call yourself a professional in this field, that I dismissed it immediately. Or I tried to, but it kept coming back. Was it possible that Yuri Shastov's wife had a personal claim to the arms on the little icon he'd given me? Was it possible that Traven had taken all those photographs of May because he wished to compare her face to another? Was it possible, even for a second, to imagine a survival, an escape, a moment of pity? If one could, then it became almost certain that Anna Kostina alone had known what had happened. If any of the family had survived the original massacre, they must have done so because of her, and if any of them had ultimately escaped or been allowed to go free, that moment of pity must have come from her heart, and later, either fearful of her failure or regretting her moment of weakness, she might have followed the fate of her own private hostage, realizing later, as her own pitiless fate was revealed, what a weapon she had. Except she couldn't possibly use it, as long as the child, or the child of the child, was still inside Russia. The child of the child. But if she'd told someone, and that person had managed to get the child out, away from Stalin's long grasp, then they would have possessed a talisman, a surety of almost magical potency. The child of the child. Did I believe it? Could anyone? Russia, as Peter the Great once said, is the land where things that don't happen, happen. God knows he was right about that. As the weeks passed and Indian summer came and went, I found myself wondering if this was one of those unhappening things. I would never know, obviously, but now it became a question of what I believed in my heart, and beliefs, notoriously, are much harder than facts. So I swung back and forth, until late in October I received the only sign, the only help that I ever would get, a message from May. Except it was hardly a message, only a photograph, May smiling into the sun with a scrawl on the back, "All our love, M." Postmarked in Schiphol, the Netherlands, the great airport for Amsterdam, it merely proved that they were alive and might be living or traveling any place in the world. And the photo wasn't any more helpful. It reminded me of that picture which had been so much in my mind, taken by May with her own brownie, for it had precisely that stolid, amateur competence of a generation brought up on box cameras. Harry Brightman was positioned with the sun right over his shoulder, and his shadow filled up the foreground while his daughter's eyes squinted into the glare. She was standing on a pier. Tied up to it, grand yachts jostled together, filing away in magnificent perspective, and a blue sea glittered beyond. It could have been Cannes, Rio, Palm Beach, any place where the rich spend their time. It could have been that same scene years ago when May had first learned that she'd been adopted. I studied her face. For hours I studied her face. She was the woman I'd loved. Was she happy? If she was who I thought she might be, did she know? There was no way to tell. The breeze pressed her dress around her legs. She had to hold her hat on with her hand, but it was hard to make out her expression. In fact, her face wasn't even in focus. It wasn't in focus because the focus of that picture was behind her, halfway down the pier. And about the 10th time I looked at it, that fact caught my eye. No, May wasn't the focus, because the focus was on one of the yachts, a good piece behind her. It was a fine old vessel, not a sailboat, but one of those old diesel yachts from the 20s, all bright varnish and shiny brass trim. One afternoon I took a glass and studied it carefully. Huge, upright, very old-fashioned, she bore the proud lines of an era when the rich were not afraid to look rich. Her deckhouse was high, the teak lovingly polished, and her name was spelled out in gilt. In itself, the style of this reminded me of both Brightman and May, reminded me of that anachronistic quality she always seemed to possess. But in truth there was nothing to connect them to it, or even, I repeat, to tie them down to this place. They might have been just passing through, spending their money, enjoying the sights, their presence here pure coincidence. Still, for whatever it's worth, the name of that yacht leapt up through my glass, bright as gold and clear as life, a hint, a hope, or a last message from Brightman. Believe what you will. In any case, I can only say what I saw, tell what I saw, and I know she was called Anastasia.